"They'll never touch you again," said the Apache to the woman forced to serve 9 lonely ranchers in one night. The blood on her hands had dried black under the desert sun, but Catherine Hayes could still feel it burning against her palms. 3 days had passed since she buried her younger sister beneath a twisted mesquite tree behind their homestead. Yet the memory of Sarah's final breath continued to echo in the hollow spaces of her chest. The Apache warrior standing before her now spoke in broken English, his weathered face carved with the same determination that had been growing inside Catherine like a wildfire. "They ride together," he said, pointing toward the distant canyon where smoke still rose from their destroyed ranch. 9 men. "They think they are wolves, but wolves hunt to survive. These men hunt for pleasure." Catherine adjusted the weight of her father's Colt revolver against her hip. The leather holster felt foreign against her dress, but she had discarded her mourning clothes that morning. Mourning was a luxury she could no longer afford. The Blackstone gang had taken everything from her family, and Sheriff Morrison had made it clear that his jurisdiction conveniently ended where their influence began. The Apache warrior, who called himself Singing Wolf, had witnessed the attack from the ridge overlooking their valley. He had seen the 9 riders approach their isolated homestead at dawn, had watched them demand supplies and water, had observed how quickly their requests turned into something far more sinister. By the time he reached the ranch, Catherine's parents lay dead in their own blood, and Sarah had been violated in ways that no 17-year-old girl should ever endure. "Why help me?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying the roughness that came from 3 days of screaming her grief into the empty desert. Singing Wolf's dark eyes fixed on the horizon where dust devils danced in the afternoon heat. "My daughter was 15 when soldiers came to our village. I know the sound a father makes when he cannot protect his child." The weight of shared understanding settled between them like the oppressive heat that shimmered off the rocky ground. Catherine had found Singing Wolf tracking the gang through the canyons, his movements as silent as shadow despite his age. He was older than her father had been, maybe 50 winters, but his body carried the coiled strength of a man who had survived decades of conflict in an unforgiving land. "They stay at Broken Creek tonight," Singing Wolf continued. "Tomorrow they ride to Millerville to sell what they stole from other ranches. Tonight is when we take them." Catherine's throat constricted around words that felt too large to speak. She had never killed anyone, had barely even fired her father's gun except to scare coyotes away from their livestock. The men they were hunting were experienced killers who had terrorized the territory for months, leaving a trail of burned homes and destroyed families in their wake. Sheriff Morrison claimed they were too elusive to catch, but Catherine suspected the monthly payments to his office had more to do with his reluctance than their cunning. The sun was beginning its descent toward the jagged mountains that bordered their valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Catherine too much of the flames that had consumed her childhood home. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage that her father had always insisted lived somewhere inside her. But all she could feel was the crushing weight of loss and the bitter taste of fear. "I have never killed a man," she admitted, the words emerging barely above a whisper. Singing Wolf nodded slowly, as if he had expected this confession. "The first death changes you, but sometimes change is the only path to survival." They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for what lay ahead. Singing Wolf showed Catherine how to move silently through brush and rock, how to use the desert's natural camouflage to remain invisible, how to steady her breathing when adrenaline threatened to overwhelm her senses. His teaching style was patient but urgent, like a man who understood that mistakes in the wilderness were often fatal. As darkness began to settle across the landscape, they could see the distant glow of the gang's campfire flickering in the canyon below. 9 silhouettes moved around the flames, their laughter carrying upward on the cool evening breeze. Catherine's stomach twisted at the sound of their casual merriment, knowing that these same men had celebrated while her family's blood soaked into the earth. "Remember," Singing Wolf whispered as they began their descent toward the canyon floor, "they expect no resistance. They have grown careless because no one has challenged them. This is our advantage." The rocks beneath Catherine's boots seemed to amplify every step, despite her attempts to mirror Singing Wolf's silent movement. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently that she worried the sound might give away their position. The weight of her father's gun felt both reassuring and terrifying, a reminder of the line she was preparing to cross. The gang's campsite was positioned in a natural clearing surrounded by towering canyon walls that would prevent easy escape once the shooting began. Catherine counted 9 horses tethered near a cluster of boulders, confirming Singing Wolf's intelligence about their numbers. The men themselves sat around their fire, passing bottles of whiskey and dividing the spoils from their recent raids. Catherine recognized their leader immediately. Marcus Blackstone was a huge man with shoulders like a bull and a beard that hung down to his chest. She had seen him once before at the general store in Millerville, where he had spoken to the shopkeeper with the casual arrogance of someone who knew the law could not touch him. Now, watching him laugh while sorting through items stolen from murdered families, Catherine felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. The tall one with the scar, Singing Wolf breathed against her ear. "He was the one who hurt your sister most." Catherine's gaze found the man Singing Wolf indicated. Jake Morrison, the sheriff's younger brother, sat slightly apart from the others, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. The irony of his name being the same as the lawman who had refused to help her family was not lost on Catherine. Justice, it seemed, would have to come from outside the system that had failed them so completely. They waited until the whiskey had done its work and the men's attention had turned inward toward their card games and crude stories. 3 of the gang members had already passed out near the edge of the camp, their weapons scattered carelessly around their unconscious forms. The remaining 6 continued their revelry, unaware that death was watching them from the shadows. Singing Wolf moved first, slipping between the boulders like smoke. Catherine saw him emerge behind one of the sleeping men, his knife finding its target with surgical precision. The man never made a sound, simply stopped breathing as quietly as he had lived. Within minutes, all 3 unconscious gang members had joined their victims in whatever judgment awaited them beyond this world. The remaining 6 men were still gathered around the fire when Catherine stepped into the circle of light, her father's gun steady in her hands despite the trembling that threatened to overwhelm her entire body. The conversation stopped abruptly as they recognized the figure standing before them, backlit by flames and radiating an intensity that seemed to draw the very air from the canyon. "Catherine Hayes," Marcus Blackstone said slowly, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and amusement. "The little ranch girl. I heard you had some trouble at your place recently." The casual cruelty in his tone ignited something primal in Catherine's chest. She thought of Sarah's broken body, of her parents' final moments, of the laughter these men had shared while her world burned around her. When she spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that surprised even her. "My sister was 17 years old." Jake Morrison leaned forward, his scarred face twisting into something that might have been a smile. "Pretty little thing, too. Shame she couldn't appreciate good company when it came calling." Catherine's finger tightened on the trigger, but Singing Wolf's teachings echoed in her mind. Patience, timing, make every shot count. She could see the other men slowly reaching for their weapons, trying to appear casual while positioning themselves for violence. "You boys made a mistake," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You thought you could take whatever you wanted from whoever you pleased. You thought there would be no consequences." Marcus Blackstone's hand was now resting on his gun belt, ready to draw. "And what consequences might those be, little girl? You planning to shoot all 6 of us with that rusty old Colt?" "No," Catherine replied. "Just you." The gunfight that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but those moments stretched like hours in Catherine's memory. Marcus Blackstone was fast, faster than she had expected, but rage and desperation proved quicker than arrogance. Her first shot caught him center mass, spinning him backward into the fire. Her second found Jake Morrison before he could clear his holster. And her third dropped another gang member who had been reaching for a rifle. Singing Wolf emerged from the shadows during the chaos, his own weapons accounting for the remaining 3 men with the efficiency of someone who had been fighting longer than Catherine had been alive. When the shooting stopped, 9 bodies lay scattered around the dying campfire, their blood slowly seeping into the desert sand. Catherine stood in the sudden silence, her gun still smoking in her hands, trying to process what had just occurred. The men who had destroyed her family were dead, but the hollow ache in her chest remained unchanged. She had expected to feel satisfaction, perhaps even joy, but all she experienced was a profound emptiness that seemed to echo through the canyon walls. "It is finished," Singing Wolf said quietly, appearing beside her like a ghost materialized from the darkness. But Catherine knew it was not finished. It could never be finished. Sarah would never laugh again, her parents would never see another sunrise, and the ranch that had been their life's work was nothing but ash and memories. Justice had been served, but justice could not resurrect the dead or heal the wounds that would never stop bleeding. They spent the rest of the night gathering the gang's stolen goods and evidence of their crimes. Among their possessions, Catherine found jewelry that had belonged to her mother, tools that her father had crafted with his own hands, and a small wooden doll that Sarah had cherished since childhood. Each item was a reminder of what had been lost, but also proof that these men had terrorized countless families across the territory. As dawn broke over the canyon, painting the rock walls in shades of gold and amber, Catherine and Singing Wolf prepared to leave the scene of their justice. The bodies would be found eventually, probably by other outlaws or drifters passing through, but that was not their concern. They had done what needed to be done. "Where will you go now?" Singing Wolf asked as they mounted their horses. Catherine looked back at the canyon where 9 men lay dead, then toward the east where the sun was climbing higher into a cloudless sky. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay towns that needed protection, families that deserved safety, and lawmen who might actually care about justice more than profit. "I think I will become someone different," she replied. "Someone who makes sure this never happens to another family." Singing Wolf nodded with understanding that came from his own journey through loss and transformation. The Apache have a saying, "We are all born as water, but life shapes us into stone." "You have become stone, Catherine Hayes. Use that strength wisely." They parted ways at the canyon's mouth, Singing Wolf disappearing into the desert like the morning mist, Catherine riding toward a future that she could not yet imagine but knew she must face alone. The woman who had buried her sister 3 days ago was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, colder, but infinitely more dangerous to those who preyed upon the innocent. 6 months later, stories began circulating through the territorial newspapers about a mysterious woman who appeared wherever injustice flourished. She was described as beautiful but deadly, compassionate but implacable, someone who offered protection to the weak and swift retribution to those who would exploit them. Some called her the Canyon Ghost, others referred to her simply as Justice, but those who knew her story understood that she was something more complex than either legend suggested. Catherine Hayes had discovered that grief could be transformed into purpose, that loss could become strength, and that sometimes the only way to heal a broken world was to ensure that others never experienced the same breaking. She carried her family's memory with her like a sacred flame, allowing it to guide her steps and steady her aim when darkness threatened to overwhelm the light. The territory was vast, filled with towns that needed protection and families that deserved peace. Catherine had found her calling in that canyon where 9 men learned too late that actions have consequences, that victims can become avengers, and that some promises, once made, are kept no matter the cost. In the end, Singing Wolf had been right about change being the only path to survival. Catherine had survived by becoming exactly what her broken world needed. Someone who would never allow evil to flourish in the shadows. Someone who would always stand between the predators and their prey, someone who understood that true justice sometimes required taking the law into your own hands. The desert wind carried her story across countless miles, inspiring hope in some hearts and fear in others, but always serving as a reminder that every action echoes through time, and that sometimes the echoes come back wearing gun leather and carrying the weight of righteous fury. Years passed like seasons in the high desert, each one marking another chapter in the legend that Catherine Hayes had become. The woman who had once tended cattle and sewn quilts by lamplight now rode the territorial boundaries like an avenging spirit. Her presence felt in every town where corruption had taken root. Sheriff Morrison had been found dead in his office one morning, a single bullet wound and a note that read simply, "Justice delayed is justice denied." No one mourned his passing. The Blackstone Gang's surviving associates learned quickly that their former immunity had died with their leaders in that canyon. 3 more gangs met similar fates over the following months, each confrontation more precisely executed than the last. Catherine had become something the territory had never seen before, a woman who understood that true law enforcement required stepping outside the boundaries that protected criminals more than victims. In the town of Esperanza, she arrived just as a group of land grabbers were preparing to burn out a family of Mexican settlers who had legal claim to their property but lacked the political connections to defend it. The confrontation lasted 15 minutes, leaving 4 would-be arsonists dead in the dusty Main Street and the rest fleeing toward the border with their tails tucked between their legs. The grateful family offered Catherine their hospitality, but she declined with the same polite distance that had become her trademark. "Gratitude is payment enough," she told the patriarch, an elderly man whose weathered hand shook as he tried to press coins into her palm. "Keep your money for your children's education. Knowledge is the only weapon that truly protects the innocent." Her reputation preceded her into every settlement, saloon, and courthouse across the territory. Some lawmen welcomed her assistance, recognizing that she accomplished what their limited resources and political constraints made impossible. Others viewed her as a dangerous vigilante whose methods threatened the established order, however corrupt that order might be. Catherine cared little for their opinions, having learned that institutional approval often came at the cost of moral compromise. The wealthy ranchers and mining interests who had previously operated with impunity began hiring additional security, posting bounties and pressuring territorial officials to put an end to what they called the Hayes problem. Their efforts proved futile against someone who had learned to move like smoke and strike like lightning. Catherine had studied her enemies as carefully as Singing Wolf had studied his prey, understanding their patterns, their weaknesses, and their inevitable overconfidence. In the mining town of Copper Falls, she encountered a situation that reminded her why she had chosen this path. A young Chinese woman named Li Wei had been kidnapped from her family's laundry and was being held by a group of miners who treated immigrant workers as less than human. The local marshal claimed his hands were tied by jurisdictional issues, but Catherine recognized the same willful blindness that had allowed the Blackstone Gang to operate with impunity. She found Li Wei locked in a storage shed behind the Lucky Strike saloon, her clothes torn and her spirit nearly broken by 3 days of captivity and abuse. The sight of the woman's bruised face transported Catherine back to that terrible morning when she had discovered Sarah's body, and the familiar cold fury began building in her chest like gathering storm clouds. "They said no one would come for me," Li Wei whispered in heavily accented English. "They said I was nothing." Catherine knelt beside the frightened woman, her voice gentle despite the violence she was planning. "They were wrong on both counts. You are someone worth saving, and I have come." The 6 miners responsible for Li Wei's kidnapping died that night in ways that ensured their deaths would be remembered and discussed in every mining camp across the territory. Catherine left their bodies arranged in the saloon's main room with a message carved into the bar: "Those who prey upon the innocent forfeit their right to live among the civilized." Word of the Copper Falls incident spread like wildfire through the immigrant communities that dotted the territorial landscape. Chinese workers, Mexican families, and Irish settlers who had previously suffered in silence began to believe that justice might actually exist for people like them. More importantly, those who profited from their exploitation began to understand that their victims now had a protector who could not be bought, intimidated, or reasoned with. Catherine's methods evolved with each encounter, becoming more sophisticated as she learned from both successes and near failures. She developed a network of informants among the honest citizens who wanted to see positive change, but lacked the courage or means to act alone. Telegraph operators passed along information about criminal movements. Shopkeepers reported suspicious activities, and even some lawmen began quietly providing intelligence about cases they were unable to pursue through official channels. The transformation was not without cost. Each act of violence left its mark on Catherine's soul, hardening something essential within her until she sometimes wondered if she was becoming the very thing she fought against. The woman who had once found joy in simple pleasures now felt disconnected from normal human emotions, as if her capacity for happiness had been buried alongside her family in that desert grave. During a rare moment of introspection in a hotel room in Silver Creek, Catherine examined her reflection in a cracked mirror and barely recognized the person staring back at her. The soft curves of youth had been replaced by lean muscle and sharp angles. Her eyes, once warm with laughter and innocence, now carried the cold calculation of someone who had seen too much death and dealt too much of it herself. She thought of singing Wolf's words about water becoming stone, wondering if she had transformed so completely that there was no way back to the person she had once been. The question troubled her more than she cared to admit, but it did not slow her pursuit of those who deserved punishment. Purpose had become her substitute for peace, justice her replacement for joy. The territorial governor, pressured by influential constituents who were losing money and men to Catherine's campaign, issued a warrant for her arrest on charges of vigilantism and murder. The reward posted for her capture was substantial enough to attract bounty hunters from 3 territories, but none proved capable of tracking someone who had learned to read the desert like a favorite book. 2 bounty hunters caught up with her near the ruins of her family's ranch, now overgrown with desert scrub and haunted by memories that would never fade. They approached with the confidence of men who had never encountered prey that could think and plan and turn the hunt back on the hunters. Catherine allowed them to get close enough to recognize the determination in her eyes before she demonstrated why their predecessors had failed so completely. The bounty hunters' bodies served as a message to others who might be tempted by the governor's reward. Hunting Catherine Hayes was a profession with a remarkably high mortality rate and no successful practitioners. After that incident, the price on her head increased significantly, but the number of people willing to pursue it dropped to nearly 0. As her legend grew, so did the mythology surrounding her exploits. Some stories claimed she could appear and disappear at will. Others insisted she had made pacts with Apache spirits that made her bulletproof. Catherine found these tales amusing in their absurdity, but she also recognized their value in deterring potential adversaries who might otherwise test their luck against her. The truth was far more mundane and infinitely more dangerous than the legend suggested. Catherine Hayes had simply become very good at killing people who needed killing, and she had surrounded herself with a network of information that allowed her to stay ahead of both enemies and the law. She was not supernatural, merely dedicated to her purpose with a single-minded intensity that most people could not comprehend. On the 5th anniversary of her family's murder, Catherine returned to the canyon where the Blackstone gang had met their fate. The bones had long since been scattered by scavengers and weather, leaving only rust stains and faded memories to mark the spot where her transformation had truly begun. She stood in the same place where she had faced down 9 armed men, remembering the terror and uncertainty that had nearly overwhelmed her courage. The woman who had stood in that canyon 5 years ago would barely recognize the person Catherine had become. The frightened ranch girl had evolved into something the territory had never seen before, a force of nature disguised as a human being, someone who could walk into any situation and emerge victorious through superior preparation, unwavering determination, and absolute ruthlessness when dealing with those who preyed upon the innocent. But transformation always came with a price, and Catherine was beginning to understand what hers had cost her. She had gained the power to protect others at the expense of her own capacity for normal human connection. The very skills that made her effective as an instrument of justice also isolated her from the communities she served. She was respected, feared, and occasionally grateful, but she was never truly welcomed, never allowed to rest, never permitted to be anything other than the legend she had created. Standing in that canyon as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Catherine made a decision that surprised even her. She would continue her work, would continue to serve as protector and avenger for those who had nowhere else to turn. But she would also begin training others to carry on when she could no longer bear the burden alone. The territory needed more than one person fighting against corruption and violence. It needed a movement, a culture of resistance that could survive beyond any individual's lifetime. The desert wind picked up as darkness settled across the landscape, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Catherine pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and walked back to where her horse waited patiently, ready to carry her toward whatever injustice awaited her attention next. Behind her, the canyon held its secrets and its ghosts, a monument to the moment when one woman's grief had transformed into a force that would reshape an entire territory's understanding of what justice could look like when it finally decided to bare its teeth.